Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us today. And we're continuing our journey through the Daodejing. We are currently in chapter 36. I'm going to go ahead and bring up my screen here. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. It's going to open up with a series of kind of contrasts. And so I'll just kind of read through those and then we can kind of talk about that a little bit. So that which shrinks must first expand. That which fails must first be strong. That which is cast down must first be raised. Before receiving, there must be giving. So we've talked about within Taoism how they make a distinction between value contrast and more natural contrast. So here we've got, down and raised, receiving and giving, and the previous ones, I'm going to go back here, shrinking and expanding and failing and strong. So each of these are going to be, in a sense, more complementary pairs. So shrinking and expanding kind of, define each other. They work in complement with each other. They're not in opposition to each other. Same thing with failing and strong. They're just kind of helping you see kind of degrees on a spectrum. And the same thing here with down and raised and receiving and giving. So the contrast that the Taoists want to help us to see is when we think about the polarities in this sense, they're complementary. When we bring in the value judgments, such as good and ugly, or beautiful and ugly, good and evil, then they are not actually complementary. They actually fight against each other. There's like a competition that has to happen. So the first thing we want to notice is that the author is actually asking us to notice each of these things. That in order for something to contract or to shrink, it has to initially have been expanded. So there's kind of this movement that once you go so far this way, then it's going to come back this way. Kind of like that pendulum that we talk about. The yin yang has it more in a circle, that things transform into each other. And there's a couple of implications from this. One is that nothing stays the same. Everything is constant. And that if you wait long enough, things tend to turn into their opposite. So this is just kind of the general setting that they're giving us here for this chapter. Now they're going to get into a couple of aspects of implications of this being the case. So it's referred to here, it says, this is called the perception of the nature of things, which we have seen is central to the Taoist thought. They want to understand how things actually work versus how we want them to work. Because if we know how they actually work, then we can get in harmony with it instead of, knocking our head against the wall trying to accomplish something that's not possible. So this perception of the nature of things is key. And one of the implications of this then is that soft and weak overcome the hard and strong. A couple of examples we've seen of this in the past are things like a young tree that's still green can weather a storm because it can bend, it's flexible. It will appear to be bent, but then it will stand upright again. But an older tree, or maybe even a dead tree that's no longer growing, it's going to be very strong and it's going to be very hard. However, when that strong wind comes, it doesn't have the ability to be flexible, and so it ends up breaking. And so those would be like one of the key contrasts they're looking at is in the long run, this soft and weak is always going to excel over something that's stiff, something that's not changing, that's something that's kind of stuck or what's the word I'm looking for here? More settled in its way, right? This is another reason why the water is such an important metaphor within Taoism because it's constantly flowing. It goes around things. And even though it's very soft, it can ultimately cut through stone. Core points then that we've seen multiple times. Now it's going to take a little bit of an interesting direction. Fish cannot leave deep water, and a country's weapons should not be displayed. So again, Daodejing is actually written more as a political treatise. How should rulers rule? If we consider the context of the Warring States period, the Warring States period in China, we have a time of social crisis where the different states are no longer unified under the empire. They're battling each other for control, and it's creating a situation of massive social disruption and chaos. And so the question that all these different philosophers that emerged during this time is, how do we get out of this mess? How do we get back? So Daodejing is one of many documents or philosophies that is trying to address that problem. And here we can see we're reminded of this political nature of the document when we see something about a country's weapons. So before we dive into breaking this down, I want to see if you have any initial thoughts, and I can go back to any of the screens if there's something you want to look at.
It reminds me of how buildings are built to sway, like the really tall buildings in big cities. They're built to sway, because if they aren't built to sway, then when a windstorm comes, they'll fall over.
Or in California, when the earthquakes happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's something we had to learn the hard way, right? Because we had a lot of disasters where we saw that the buildings that weren't flexible, the kind of trouble we would get into.
I think about the Russians and the Chinese and wanting to parade all of their weapons, and try to show their power and their strength.
Yeah. Yeah, you definitely see that sometimes a little bit more pronounced in different contexts. It's interesting at certain times, even here we'll do that, depending on different parts of the country, if they're, more, let's say, patriotic than others. When you have things like different parades, they'll want to like bring out the tanks and, march the troops. And, we'll still have some of that weapons on display here as well. And maybe even if we think about a lot of our movies. Air shows, yeah. And what was that? That one team is blue something. I can't remember now. It's like a fighters jet squadron. I think they were called the Blue. Drawing a blank now, but yeah, there's those types of shows. But also, if we think about like media, movies, we frequently will have things that demonstrate America's military prowess, when we get into different wars, or if we're, doing some kind of subversive movement into another country and so forth. So we have our displaying as well. It seems to be something that's fairly ubiquitous with a lot of the countries, is that there's a desire to be able to demonstrate that, or to put those things on display to show that they have that strength. But I'm curious if you have some initial thoughts on why it says fish cannot leave deep water. Does that feel like
just what I'm stuck on?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, huh? Well, let's come back to that. We'll move forward and look at first the contrasts that are happening with the yin yang. So one of the principal things we have to recognize is that everything is constantly in change. In fact, this is one of the core tenets, is there isn't anything constant except for change. Change is the one thing that is always happening. So if that is the case, what are some implications that we need to be thinking about in terms of how we think about our own lives? But also remember, all of this is not only at the personal level, but also at the political level. So if we think about that idea of resistance, or excuse me, of the hard and strong, that one of the ways that this could be looked at is a resistance to the idea of change. So that could be a key thing to consider, is in thinking about ourselves, but also in terms of nation states, um, are we trying to resist that change, or are we flexible and able to work with the change? And this is a tough one because humans tend to like to keep things the same. We don't like it when stuff changes, whether it's, minor things like a change in job or having to move somewhere, or more dramatic things like the death of a loved one, or things like shifting political alliances or wars. And obviously, there's a lot of things that can be very difficult to deal with. But we definitely desire for things to be the same, for some stability, for some constancy. But if the reality is that things aren't always the same, that they continuously do change, then when we resist that change, we are setting ourselves up for the same type of trouble as that tree that's no longer flexible, or as Taylor brought up about buildings that are no longer able to give with the sway. And that can lead to collapse, or to things breaking, or to, some other kind of internal problems. If we're thinking personally, a lot of our suffering comes from mental attitudes in which people are dealing with the problems of things not being the way that they want them to be, or resisting that they have changed. And so this is where that idea then of being flexible is going to be much more important. And for the things or the attitudes in which we have that flexibility, we'll be able to navigate a number of different ways of approaching life's changes. Oops. Sorry. There we go. The other thing that it should help us to recognize is that when we're thinking about something like certainty, we need to realize this is always going to be, or always should be, provisional. Because there's always going to be change that happens, but there's always going to be new perspectives that we see, and there's going to be maybe new information that we have. We are very limited in our ability to have a certain amount of information. We can never know everything about anything. So we have to have a little bit of that humility about what do we know, or what do we think that we know. So even if there's things that we have a lot of confidence in, we always need to recognize that there's a degree of provisionalness with that. When we fail to recognize that, and we get stuck in our certainty as though this is an absolute, that's where things again can be very stubborn. They can be resisting. They can be trying to be fixed. And we'll see that in a lot of different ways of thinking about the world, where people's ideas can become stuck and not able to adjust. And that can also be very detrimental. And then, of course, there's always going to be more than one perspective that we've kind of talked about. So I'll kind of pause here for a moment, and let's hear from you on thoughts about yin yang and life, and the challenge of wanting things to be the same versus becoming more accepting of the change. Does anybody find themselves at times wrestling with change and wishing things would be the same?
Yeah, of course. I think it's hard because I'm aware that like we struggle with change, but even knowing that, when change comes along, I still am resistant to it. Like, even if I try to not be resistant to it,
Yeah.
it's, you still have that feeling that's like, ooh, this is uncomfy.
So do you have any ways that you try to address that when you recognize that's happening?
Yeah, I always try to look for like a silver lining or like something to look forward to, like, oh, this is changing, but it's good because dot dot dot, and try to focus on that instead of the fact that it's changing and now I have to adapt to it.
Hmm. Anybody else have some thoughts on this?
I've learned that how you handle change is dependent on control. For example, when my wife and I decided to buy and move into a house, that was a huge change, but we were super excited for it. Like that we weren't upset or scared because that was within our power. So that's a change that we were super ready for. But then you have the change that everybody else thinks about that's not in your control. The best example I have at the top of my head is when ServiceNow changed their UI. They completely overhauled it. So a new version. And I hated it at first. And I'm still not a big fan of it, but it's one of those things of, okay, it's different now. And kind of like to Taylor's point of, well, this is what you get and make it work. And there's no point in being upset and complaining about it. The change is here. So what do you do with it? So you got to handle it in a proper manner.
Yeah, I mean that's a key thing because they're not going to roll that back, right? So if we continue to resist against it, in the case where, you're a developer of ServiceNow, you're going to be you're not going to be able to do your job.
Yeah, and I think to that point, I think often when we're hit with something that maybe frustrates us, it may force us to become really creative and think about solutions, ways around it. So maybe that is what is the impetus for creating new things that are maybe bigger and better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, frequently something will happen in our lives that we're resisting, let's say losing a job, but then all of a sudden we end up with a different job that's maybe even better than before. And we're like, oh, this, it kind of goes back to the farmer with the horse that runs away, right? Where we have to have that more extended perspective. And when these changes happen, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Well, now we've entered into that value judgment, right? That we're labeling it as something that's bad. And because it's a value judgment, it's at war with something that's good. It's not just something on the spectrum. But if we can remove those value judgments and take the longer perspective where we're saying, well, we'll see how this is going to unfold, that's a really excellent strategy for how we look at and receive change as well. So, does anybody have techniques that they use in their lives to help them to be more flexible and more open to change?
I've learned to not let emotions get in the way. So if something changes, it's natural to get upset, but you need to get through the feelings and then move on because those just hold you back. Because it's kind of resisting is kind of how sometimes the emotional response is. So the more you get emotional about it, you say, I hate this, I hate this, I hate this. That's not helping anything. So I've learned that yes, you need to kind of have those emotions and let them go through their emotion and then move on and then move to, okay, what do I do with this?
Hmm. Yeah, that self-talk can be really sabotaging. The story that we tell ourselves. I don't like this, or I can't do it, or I don't want this. Those can be things that definitely work against us for sure.
It's so hard to break free from too once you get into that habit of, you know, telling yourself you can't do something.
Mm-hmm. So
I
is
think
it, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think just like along with what Chaz said, learning to accept something once it happens, because once it happens, I mean, you're not going to rewind time, right? So quickly settling with the initial feeling and then accepting it and figuring out how to roll on from there is really how I've tried to do it.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about how do we respond to change when it happens. Does anybody work on anything in themselves in preparation before change happens to make it easier to adjust to change?
Well, one subset of change, I guess, is grieving. And Andrew Huberman did an episode about the neurology of grief, where he explained basically it's like when the brain has it has a place for things that are present, and it has a place for things that are in the past. So when you lose someone and your brain is trying to place them in the present but can't find them, can't reach out to them, etc., then it creates agitation and anxiety. That is sort of like in a runaway feedback loop, because there's nothing to quell it. The process of grief is moving that that agreed for thing from the present place in the mind to the place in the past. So you see it as something that used to be rather than something that is. And I found this helpful last year. I had a cat that died, and I took it really hard. And I noticed that as long as I was feeling like and telling myself, my cat is dead, I can't help her, I lost my cat, that sort of thing, it was really painful. But when I start to think thoughts like, for a time I had this really wonderful cat and she was with me for a while and I really enjoyed her, then those kind of thoughts feel more comforting, that rather than painful. And so since I got that cat, some other cats showed up. So I've got 3 other cats now, but I once in a while I think about what it'll be like when they're dead, and I imagine them dead, and I imagine, oh, they're only going to be here for so long, they only last so long. I hope it's as long as possible and they die in my arms, but it's only so long. And someday this little furry creature will be dead, and I imagine holding them, their dead bodies, and what it will feel like. And I I try to get a little bit of the grieving out of the way ahead of time, like grieve for them before they're dead a little bit, so that when it happens, I'll already have at least somewhat moved through that.
Yeah, that's something that within the Stoic tradition is a big part of how they address this. They have a practice that sometimes is referred to as negative visualization. And it's precisely that, where you think about something in your life that you care about and you imagine what it's going to be like without it, right? And it could be something as mundane as, my favorite coffee mug, or it could be something more significant like someone that's a loved person in your life. And it would definitely be something that's more on that proactive side, where it helps us to keep that idea of change in front of us so that we're not surprised when it happens, or that we're not resisting it, but we're trying to find ways to incorporate that into the bigger picture of things so that there's a way to make sense out of it. And I think that's probably one of the other key factors is, yes, we need to be prepared for when that change happens, but if we have a mechanism by which we can, in our minds, situate all these changes, This goes a long ways towards addressing that issue as well. So within more traditional religions, of course, they have this idea of an afterlife, and this would be one of the ways that that is put in context or given meaning, and that it's not an ultimate goodbye, it's only a temporary goodbye. At least if we're talking about people, it's not always the same for, you know, things, and sometimes not for animals, depending on people's different religious beliefs. But within Taoism and a lot of classical Chinese philosophy, there isn't this idea of an afterlife. There's only this life. And so what is the context in which they handle it there? Or even if we're talking about in a more modern sense, where people are coming from more of a secular or naturalist perspective, where there's also not this idea of an afterlife. Well, one of the core things within Taoist thought, one is we're seeing that there's this constant change. And so when we think about something like birth, and when we think about death, that these are not like interruptions into something that is constant and fixed, or something that is an intrusion into the way that reality works. But we recognize that even all throughout life, it is constant change. And that when we get to something like death, it's not like this sudden intrusion of something that's unlike everything else that happens, but it's one more step in that ongoing phase of constant change, kind of like this yin yang, that, you know, things are going to go this way and then it's going to circle back around this other way. There was a time before I was alive, and there'll be a time after I was alive. And then they also will put it into this understanding, like a more kind of metaphysical type of a question, you know, what is the nature of reality? And they would say, well, everything is actually one thing. And all the things that we interact with are different configurations of things that manifest in a way that they appear as individual separate things to us. But in reality, everything is actually just one thing, that we're all actually connected. And the more we can have our identity in this larger context of everything is one thing, then when we experience the loss either of others or of ourselves or of other things, we recognize that everything that was a part of any of those things is still here. It's still part of this big oneness that gets configured in different ways. And if that's more where my identity lies, then there's a different way now that we're looking at that change. Change is more as transition, not necessarily ceasing, right? Now, there are definitely aspects of our personal experience that will end. And that is definitely something that has an impact on how we think about that. But there's a certain comfort to understanding how we fit into this long chain of how everything, you know, in a sense, kind of continues to exist, and the parts, in a sense, kind of get recycled, right? It's everything that makes up my current body, even though I'm constantly shedding, you know, parts of myself, and it's actually different cells that have actually died. There's new ones that kind of grow, and ultimately, when I finally die, all the pieces are going to essentially get reused. When we breathe in oxygen or air, we are breathing in molecules that were, you know, breathed in by dinosaurs. You know, it's just kind of keeps getting reused. And, you know, the stuff that makes up my body is going to make up something else. That's not necessarily the way everybody likes to think about it, but this is the way the Taoists were dealing with it, and how they understood their relationship to the larger whole, and the context that gave meaning to how they thought about life and death and change and process. So there would be, much like Dane was saying, a time of reflection ahead of time about the nature of reality, the nature of life, the nature of death, that helped to prepare oneself for experiencing these different losses and changes throughout life. And these changes could be positive changes as well as negative, right? So they have a lot of concern about not getting too excited about things like positive change, like the idea of promotions or suddenly receiving a lot of wealth, because they would say, if it goes one direction, it's going to come back around the other way. So, don't get too comfortable.
One of the things that I'm struggling with is the hard and strong versus soft and weak. Experiencing the warring states, I would imagine that there might be that fear that if I am soft and weak, that I'm going to be overtaken and forced by the hard and strong.
Certainly. And that would be a regular concern, I think, at their time as well. And this would be one of the reasons why it's a bit more of a counterintuitive move. But the justification for it is they would say, look at nature, look at reality. How do things function? Something might seem strong and immovable, but then all of a sudden it's now decayed and broken down. So does that strong and hard actually give you what you're looking for in terms of this idea of constancy or keeping things the same? And here they would say, that's a bit of an illusion. We cling to it because we think it's the thing that we need. And this is certainly what the states are doing. But then look at what's happened. And it's total chaos and they're all fighting each other, right? So this would be where they are venturing into a realm that can seem like it's not going to work. If we take it into some of the traditional religious beliefs, many of them have a strong commitment to nonviolence, which would seem to be counterintuitive to the idea of, how do you resist somebody that's embracing violence? And there's all kinds of strategies that go along with that, where we find that what is often behind violence might be something like misunderstandings or needs that need to be addressed that aren't being addressed, or a lot of things that could be handled in different ways rather than just trying to prevent them from doing whatever they're doing. And it's not an easy road, but if we're thinking about lasting change, I say lasting, if we're trying to find something that's going to be a little bit more even keel, yes, there's going to be changes and there are going to be ups and downs, but they're not going to be the extreme up and downs, right? It's not going to be extreme violence and extreme chaos, but we're going to go through medium chaos. That's going to go back to medium, things seem like they're in order. And even though it's continuing to have that cycle, it's something that's much more within the bounds of what makes for the possibility of life and well-being. Can't get into all the strategies that work with something like nonviolence, but frequently the thing that brings an end to the cycle of violence is not responding with violence. That when one receives the injustice and doesn't respond in kind, that can have the effect of diffusing it. And sometimes that'll come at personal cost. But if that personal cost is seen as something as valuable for that larger goal of how do we bring peace to this situation? How do we bring, something that's going to be a better world for my kids to grow up in? Then it gives us the resources that we might need to take those self-sacrificing moves. This actually brings us to an interesting transition to the state question, which actually begins with the strange thing about fish. Any thoughts on why fish can't leave deep water?
Maybe it's just an analogy, like just as fish can't leave deep water, or fish shouldn't leave deep water, weapons should not be displayed, something like that. It's just a parallel.
Oh, yeah, certainly it's making that connection. But what's the significance of, like, what would happen if a fish leaves deep water?
Well, if it comes out of the water, it would suffocate. If it's a very deep water fish that's brought into shallower water, it will explode due to not having its accustomed pressure on the outside. So basically, the fish would not continue to live.
Okay. So yeah, a deep water fish. I'm going to assume that the Chinese weren't probably thinking about fish exploding, but yeah, definitely there's some boundaries, right? If it's a deep water animal or fish, but in general, if a fish is hidden in deeper water versus more exposed in shallow water, what is at risk?
Getting picked up by a bird.
It risks being eaten by a larger fish.
Yeah, or fishermen, right? Something that's predatory, or it exposes them in a way. So here we have kind of an interesting caveat, so to speak, in terms of flexibility, that there's boundaries. So even though we have the idea that there's the yin yang and we want to be flexible, we don't want to be too flexible in a certain sense because there's boundaries that don't make sense to go outside of. And so for a fish, it's staying hidden is one of the ways that it preserves its life. When it wanders out of where it's supposed to be, then it opens itself up to, fishermen or birds or other predators within the water. So this would be one of the key things then, is that there's this idea of wisdom. And I think we've talked a little bit about wisdom in the past. One of the key aspects of it, I think, has to do with understanding the boundaries that are needed for whatever system ecology that we're looking at. So for the fish, they will need to be flexible. They need to be agile and be able to move around, but they need to not just take that anywhere. There's ranges in which that makes sense for a fish, that if they go outside of that, they could be inviting trouble. So although we're dealing with this idea of flexibility and that we need to understand the range of options with yin yang, there's still this outer limits that we need to understand if we're going to do this wisely. So as Dane was saying, if this then is the analogy for the weapons, we could start to ask the question, okay, what is the boundaries or the wisdom for the state in understanding this idea of flexibility that might come into play with this idea of displaying weapons? So I guess that would be the question here is, what do you think they're trying to say then, that a state should not put their weapons on display? And maybe the first question is, what are they attempting to do when they put their weapons on display? What is the reason they would want to?
Weapons have a deterrent effect. Weapons, if your enemy doesn't know you have the big weapon, then they're more likely to attack you. Whereas if they know you have the big weapon, they're less likely. So with like warfare and espionage, which of course the art of war is all about, there are certain things you want your enemy to know and certain things you don't want your enemy to know. And if you just like in nature, animals that are poisonous or toxic are brightly colored to advertise that fact. Because if it was a secret, then the animal that ate them would die, but they would still also be dead. It wouldn't help keep them alive.
Yeah. Okay, so there could be some strategy in terms of keeping things hidden in order to not have the enemy know what you have, but the temptation to display the weapons, as we've seen, tends to be the case with nation states. They want people to see their power. They're basically ends up being a show of force, maybe kind of like the brightly colored animals that you're talking about that might be poisonous or whatnot.
You want to basically show your strength and hide your weakness is the art of war philosophy.
Yeah, and Sun Tzu is another one of the philosophers that comes out of this 100 schools of thought during this Warring States period, right? So the art of war is another one of these documents that comes out of this period. So, show of force is what's being done. It's a way of trying to suppress different types of actions, right? But what's happening here is that it's an attempt to coerce social behavior. So we could think about it in terms of enemies, but it can also happen internally, right? It's a show of the strength of the government that is also meant to deal with internal as well as external potential threats. But what happens then, and this would be one of the key things that the Taoists are bringing up, is that when you coerce behavior, it comes with resistance. People don't like to be forced to do certain things. And one of the main images that happens again within the Daodejing is this idea of the carved wood, right? That's the coercion that's being done to try and shape people, literally in that image, into a shape that isn't who they are, but it's for somebody else's benefit. And that level of coercion is often met with resistance. And this would be one of the key things that the Taoists are recognizing as what brought about this social chaos that they're living in at that time, is an attempt to try and fit these round pegs into square holes. And the process of trying to whittle them down to fit properly is what's bringing about the resistance that ultimately is overflowing into this idea of chaos. So if we were going to think about what this means then from the state perspective, we've got a question of wisdom. And part of what I think would be brought out here is not to look at the citizens as enemies. That how the state wants to try and do what it's doing is finding a way to work with the uncarved wood, where the Taoists would say you want to have much more of a kind of a hands-off approach in terms of trying to get everything to be a certain way and let things kind of expand in more of their natural way. And so the role of the state is not so much how do we enforce this coercion, but how do we maintain the environment in which the natural processes of how humans interact with each other can be allowed to flourish, as opposed to trying to fit everything into its predetermined boxes. Of course, to do that, you've got to have a good idea of, well, what is that natural way for things to unfold? And that's why they have such a concern about how does nature work and how can we implement a similar thing when we're thinking about structuring how humans live together. Of course, we could also bring in questions about how this works with, external as well as internal. But I know Dane's had a fair amount to say on this, which is very similar to what I've brought up here. Does anybody else have some thoughts or questions about this? Instead of countries, we could also think about this in terms of companies, let's say, or things that we're associated with, different groups, organizations, religions. How do they function along these lines in terms of understanding those boundaries and the question of conformity and coercion?
I've been thinking about it just on an individual level, like if you're busy trying to show off to other people, then what good are you really doing for yourself? And really, like, how can you grow if you're just focusing on trying to show off and not having like humility? That's kind of the road I'm going down.
Yeah. It's always good to bring it back to the personal as well. Does it seem difficult to think about it in terms of state behavior or organizational behavior because it's something that's a little bit more out of our control, or things that we don't have influence over? Is that why it's maybe a little more difficult to think about it at this level?
Yeah, I think it's easier to think about it as an individual because I am an individual. I've never been in the position to of like state or, business really.
Anybody else? Well, we'll bring in the kind of the final thought I had here. So if we're thinking about yin yang from the state's perspective, then the idea of that show of force is getting back to that idea of resistance to change. So it's stemming from this idea that there's a certain way that things need to be, and they're trying to enforce that, and they're trying to maintain it instead of being open to things changing. And this is a tough one again, because in the same way that people have that struggle, institutions are made up of people who get caught up in, if I just have enough money, if I just have enough power, then I can get things to stay the same, as opposed to having to deal with or learn to focus on, the changes, the changefulness of things. So it's an interesting dilemma that we find ourselves in at all different levels, from the personal all the way up, in terms of our resistance to change and what steps we take to try and avoid that change. I'm going to stop sharing here and we can go back to, we had a couple other folks pop in. Hello, Rob. Chaz, I saw you came in. So any other thoughts overall about what we talked about? Does this give you any thoughts about things you want to try to implement in order to engage with more of this yin yang approach to life?
Makes me think of people who are like really holding strong onto traditions instead of finding new ways to do things and willingly being creative to get on top of change before it forcefully happens. And so maybe I can be more creative and start to change things proactively.
That's good. What did people think about Dane's idea of proactively practicing grief?
Well, I would say it's a good thing if it's increasing your overall appreciation of what's in your life, but not if it's like making you pessimistic or depressed.
Mm-hmm.
That means you're doing it wrong.
Yeah, I feel like you got to be careful with that one.
Yeah, along with that negative visualization that the Stoics have, they have a phrase, memento mori, and it basically means remember your death. And the goal of that is to help you to value the time that you have, so that you focus on the things that actually matter and not getting caught up in the things that don't matter. And so they had some interesting ways of doing that. This is one of the things on my desk that can seem rather like gruesome, but it's actually part of that Stoic idea of memento mori, is that having that reminder.
Can you show it again, Jim? I didn't see.
Oh, sure. It's just a skull.
Oh,
yeah.
I actually have my cat's skull.
Oh, yeah.
I decided to keep it.
And it helps us, or ideally, it's one of the ways that we can help to remember, that we're mortal, and that we need to use our time wisely, or at least try to focus on the things that actually are important to us, and not get caught up sometimes in the minutia that can be just often needless bickering about things, or resisting things, or fighting about things that maybe at the end of the day don't really matter.
Yeah, I think that kind of ties into like, don't respond with violence. These days, it's don't respond with just petty argument, really. Like if somebody tries to argue with you about something silly, like semantics or something, just don't respond.
Mm.
Makes it a lot
Don't end
easier.
up participating in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I was in New York, I lived on a farm, and I really became aware of the cycle of life. So we lost animals, we saw birth coming, and it gave me a focus of being able to say, okay, I have to let go. Like Dwayne, I lost a very, very loving cat, and went out and adopted 4 more to replace my grief.
Actually, after I intentionally adopted the one, and the other three just showed up. They just wandered in from the wilderness.
We call that the cat distribution system.
That's fun. Yeah, where we live is a bit more rural, and we've got a pretty good posse of feral cats that run around that we're very excited about, because it definitely helps to keep the rodent population in check.
Yeah, it's just a matter of catching the cats and then neutering them and then releasing them back so you don't get too many of them.
Rodents and everything else, birds, squirrels, lizards, grasshoppers.
We do have coyotes where we live too, so we don't have to really worry about the cats getting too populous. But yeah, it's interesting. There's this whole cycle of predators that happen out here. We go through
Keeping each other
phases.
in check.
Yeah. We have phases where there's a bunch of rabbits running around, and then all of a sudden they're all gone.
That happened to us. All spring there were rabbits everywhere.
Predator prey cycles follow each other in a phase shifted sinusoidals, which means basically the predator population goes up, and then the prey population goes down, and the predator population goes down, and the prey population goes up, and the predator population goes up, and the prey population goes down. So that just kind of happens all the time.
Yeah, one of the things I think about is that when humans interfere with that process, it really causes some problems. So in New York, we got an excess of the deer population, which caused a lot of problems because we had diseases that were caused because of it. And I think that interference of the natural order of things can be a serious problem.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to think about that balancing act, how all of our actions actually impact something else, because everything is connected, and figuring out that balance, that wisdom of what are those boundaries that we can operate within, that and essentially add to that ongoing cycle of that environment, versus things that will, take it out of balance, where there's too much yang and not enough yin, or vice versa. And how do you keep that cycle much more balanced, so that even though things aren't the same and things continue to change, they change within the boundaries that are beneficial for human flourishing? Or the Taoists wouldn't be specifically concerned about just humans, but life in general is able to continue and exist in a way of well-being. Yeah.
Learning that everything is a cycle and everything needs balance.
Yeah. And we have the unique position as humans who are self-conscious that we have to wrestle with our tendency towards having things stay the same and not changing, that can really be at the root of what interferes in a lot of these areas.
Yeah, I was thinking about what Dane was saying about like I forget what it was called, negative
Visualization.
Visualization, yeah. Andrew Huberman actually was talking kind of along the opposite lines for, I think it was like a habit episode or something, where as if you want to keep something up, like if you want to keep a habit going, you can use negative visualization to say, okay, if I don't keep doing this, what does failure look like? And if you actually visualize yourself failing, then it it can motivate you to keep going, keep at it.
Yeah, for
So.
sure. Yeah, and one other interesting benefit of that is, in terms of the negative visualization, is we have a tendency to adapt very quickly to positive things. And so, we might have something that comes into our life that we really like, and or that we really wanted, and then we get it, and very quickly it just becomes part of everything else, right? It's kind of lost its specialness. And that can lead to, well, I got this one car, but man, now I really want this car, and it can lead on this cycle of like constantly trying to get more and more to reach that level of, I want that happiness again. And so the technical term for this is hedonic adaptation, that we adapt very quickly to the things that we want to get once we get them. And so the negative visualization is a way to kind of counteract that. That will help with keeping that in check. So if I have that new car and I really envision sometimes what would it be like if I was in a car accident, or it got repossessed or got stolen, then it can help to maintain that appreciation for that thing, so that we're not so tempted to continuously try to achieve more and more and more.
The
Yeah.
Buddhists talk about both clinging and aversion as equally the source of suffering. It's either resisting what's in front of you, or craving something that's not. Kind of two sides of the same coin.
Well, we're at our time. I think this is a good discussion. Glad you could all join us today. And if you're watching this on video and you'd like to be a part of our live discussions, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll get emails with the links for our Friday morning Zoom conversations. And if you happen to be in the Southern California area, there's a live presentation meeting that happens on Sunday mornings. So hope to see you all then. Take care.
Bye. Thanks, Jim.